They called it purification, but the screams told a different story. In 1534, a London executioner fainted mid-torture after watching a man's eyes literally boil in their sockets. And that wasn't even the worst method used that century. History textbooks give us sanitized versions of medieval punishment, quick mentions of dungeons and executions, but they deliberately omit the calculated, systematic brutality that defined justice for centuries. What they don't tell you is that torture wasn't just about pain, it was theater, psychology, and political messaging wrapped in iron and fire. The methods you're about to discover were so disturbing that even hardened executioners requested transfers, so effective at spreading terror that entire populations would rather die than face them, and so meticulously documented that we know exactly how long victims survived, down to the minute. This isn't folklore or exaggeration. These are verified historical practices backed by court records, medical observations, and eyewitness accounts that scholars tried to bury because they revealed something uncomfortable about human nature. We like to think cruelty is the exception, but for most of recorded history, it was official policy. So before we begin, understand this. Every method you're about to hear was legal, public, and often celebrated. The question isn't whether humanity is capable of such horror. The question is why we pretend it never happened. Let's start with something that sounds almost mundane until you understand the physics of pain. Boiling alive wasn't a quick plunge into scalding water. It was a carefully controlled process designed to maximize suffering while keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. In China, during the Qin dynasty around 200 BCE, bronze cauldrons were used to execute political traitors, and the practice spread throughout Asia and eventually Europe. But it reached its peak of legal legitimacy in England under Henry VIII. In 1531, Parliament passed the Boiling Act, which made boiling alive the mandatory punishment for poisoners. This wasn't symbolic legislation. Court records showed dozens of people were sentenced under this law during its 9-year existence. The procedure followed a brutal routine. Guards would strip the condemned and bind their hands and feet to prevent escape or interference. The executioner would then lower the body into a massive vat, sometimes filled with water, sometimes with oil, and occasionally with wine for nobility. Here's where the cruelty becomes calculation. The fire underneath started low, deliberately low, because rapid boiling caused shock too quickly. They wanted the temperature to rise slowly so the victim could feel every degree increase. Medical observers, and yes, doctors attended these executions, noted that screaming typically lasted 3 to 7 minutes before shock set in, though some victims remained conscious for over 10 minutes. The variables mattered. Water took longer to reach lethal temperatures, meaning more prolonged suffering. Oil burned hotter and faster, but caused more visible damage, which served the public spectacle. The most famous case shocked even medieval London's jaded population. Richard Roos, a cook, was accused of poisoning soup intended for the Bishop of Rochester's household in 1531. Several people died from the poisoned meal, and Roos was convicted of petty treason, a crime considered worse than murder because it involved betraying one's master. They didn't hang him. They boiled him alive in Smithfield Market, one of London's busiest public spaces. Contemporary chronicles estimate several thousand spectators watched the execution, and the story circulated through taverns and markets for months afterward. The psychological impact was immediate and measurable. City records from 1532 show a dramatic drop in theft and poisoning charges throughout London. But here's the darker layer that historians quietly discovered in medical archives. Surgeons and anatomists attended these executions not just as witnesses but as researchers. They took detailed notes on skin response, the progression of shock, heat tolerance levels, and the body's breaking points. Torture and execution weren't just punishment in this era, they were involuntary contributions to early medical knowledge. The line between justice and human experimentation was razor thin, often non-existent. This pattern of turning suffering into spectacle and science repeats throughout every method we'll discuss today. When execution by heat became too common to inspire fear, authorities escalated to mechanical torture, and the Iron Maiden became the icon of calculated cruelty. Looking at this device, you immediately know something is wrong. It resembles a human-shaped coffin, but when the doors swing open, dozens of sharp metal spikes point inward from every surface, each positioned with surgical precision. Victims weren't gently laid inside. They were pushed hard, forced into the embrace of iron needles that penetrated shoulders, thighs, arms, and back simultaneously. But here's the engineering genius behind the horror. The spikes were deliberately positioned to miss vital organs, especially the heart and major arteries. The goal wasn't quick death, but prolonged bleeding while maintaining consciousness. Some spikes were placed just below eye level, so any forward movement risked blinding. Historical records from 16th century Germany describe torture sessions using similar devices lasting between 6 and 24 hours. Yes, hours of impalement. The spacing between spikes was mathematically calculated not to kill immediately but to puncture slowly, and any movement drove them deeper. One documented case describes a prisoner who survived over 18 hours before finally dying from blood loss and infection. The most famous Iron Maiden came from Nuremberg, where it was allegedly used during public executions in the town square. But modern historians uncovered a troubling truth. The Iron Maiden we see in museums today might not be genuinely medieval. Evidence suggests these devices were recreated in the 18th and 19th centuries, possibly based on earlier torture concepts, but sensationalized for exhibit purposes. However, this doesn't mean the method is fabricated. Ancient Romans used similar coffin-like punishment chambers with internal blades. Inquisitors throughout Europe employed iron masks and spiked boxes. The psychology was identical, personal, slow, and theatrically painful. Whether the specific artifact is authentic or reconstructed, the torture concept absolutely existed and was used to devastating psychological effect. The Iron Maiden represented something more than physical pain. It was the embodiment of being consumed by justice itself, trapped inside the very system meant to protect society. Victims entered the Maiden as humans and emerged as warnings. That transformation from person to political message is what makes these methods so disturbing. We're not just looking at violence, we're examining systematic dehumanization. If the Iron Maiden used spikes to pierce from outside, the Judas chair attacked from below with even more sadistic precision. Picture a chair covered entirely in metal spikes, over 500 sharpened iron points covering the seat, backrest, armrest, and footrest. Every surface designed to support a human body was instead designed to puncture it. Victims were stripped completely naked before being strapped into position, fully conscious and aware of what was coming. The restraints tightened slowly, pressing bare skin against cold iron. Every breath caused the spikes to dig deeper. Every involuntary muscle twitch meant more blood. There was no position that didn't cause agony, no moment of relief, no escape. This device wasn't designed for quick execution. It was built for hours of sustained pain, typically used during the Spanish Inquisition and throughout 17th century France. As an interrogation tool. The distinction matters because these victims weren't just being punished. They were being forced to confess, to implicate others, to break psychologically before their bodies gave out. If the victim refused to talk, torturers would light a fire underneath the chair, heating the metal spikes, until skin began to burn and melt onto the iron. The combination of piercing and burning created a level of pain that modern medicine can barely comprehend because we have nothing equivalent to compare it to. In one documented case from 1643, a French prisoner lasted 11 hours on the Judas chair before passing out from blood loss. By that point, the damage was catastrophic and permanent. Many victims who survived, and survival was possible though rare, could never sit or walk properly again. Nerve damage was extensive, and infection from the hundreds of puncture wounds was nearly guaranteed. But why torture in this specific way? Because the Judas chair served a dual purpose. It extracted confessions while simultaneously creating a public spectacle of suffering. These chairs were often placed in open courtyards or market squares where crowds could gather and watch someone endure hours of agony. The message was crystal clear: speak when we ask, obey without question, or you're next. The psychological warfare extended beyond the victim to everyone who witnessed or even heard about the torture. Fear became policy, and devices like the Judas chair were the enforcement mechanism. Where puncturing from outside or below seemed insufficient, executioners developed methods to attack from within, and sawing humans in half became the ultimate expression of methodical butchery. The setup was counterintuitively precise. Victims were hung upside down, legs spread wide and secured separately, with blood rushing to the head. This inverted position wasn't accidental. It was physiological manipulation designed to keep the brain oxygenated and conscious for as long as possible during the cutting. Two executioners would then take a large, rough saw, the kind used for lumber, and begin cutting from between the legs downward through the torso. The saw was intentionally dull and jagged because a sharp blade would have been too efficient, too quick, too merciful. They wanted the cutting to take time, for every stroke to tear and rip, rather than slice cleanly. Used extensively in medieval Europe, parts of Asia, and throughout the Ottoman Empire, this method was reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, rebellion, assassination attempts, and religious heresy. The process typically took 3 to 5 minutes of continuous sawing, though victims remained conscious for most of that duration, due to the inverted position maintaining blood flow to the brain. Under Emperor Caligula's reign in Rome from 37 to 41 CE, political enemies were sawn in half in public forums, with soldiers actively mocking and taunting victims throughout the ordeal. The historian Jean Thévenot witnessed this torture firsthand in 16th century Persia during his travels. He wrote with disturbing precision, "The man was fastened by the legs and sawed asunder till he died, which was not till the saw had reached the navel. Sometimes the cutting was performed vertically, right down the body's midline from head to pelvis. Other times it was horizontal, across the torso. In extreme cases designed to maximize suffering and public impact, executioners would pause halfway through the cutting, leaving the victim partially sawn, still alive and screaming, visible to crowds for extended periods before completing the execution. This wasn't hidden in dungeon darkness. These were public ceremonies, often announced days in advance, with prime viewing positions reserved for nobles and officials. The human body, when sawn this way, reveals its internal structure in grotesque detail. Spectators could see exactly what centuries of medical secrecy had hidden: the layers of muscle, the positioning of organs, the color and texture of different tissues. Once again, execution served a dual purpose as both punishment and involuntary anatomical demonstration. Some torture devices didn't cut or saw or pierce at all. They operated on an even more insidious principle: forced expansion from within. The pear of anguish looked deceptively small and harmless, shaped like a metal fruit with a smooth exterior. But this device had 4 sharp petals that, when a screw on top was turned, slowly opened inside the victim's body, tearing everything in their path. The pear was inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on the alleged crime, or honestly, depending on the torturer's mood and the victim's gender. Women accused of witchcraft or adultery typically faced vaginal insertion. Men accused of sodomy or blasphemy received rectal insertion. Those accused of heresy or blasphemy often had the device placed in their mouth. This wasn't torture designed for public viewing. It was intimate, shameful, and psychologically devastating in ways that external injuries couldn't match. The screw mechanism didn't need to be turned far. 1 or 2 full rotations provided enough expansion to tear delicate internal tissues. Turn it further, and it could shatter jaws, rupture intestinal walls, or destroy reproductive organs completely. Some versions featured small spikes on each petal, so the expansion wasn't just pressure but active laceration. In 1620s France, a priest accused of heresy had the pear inserted into his mouth and cranked open until his jaw broke in 2 places. He survived, but could never speak again, which was precisely the point. Silence enforced through mechanical destruction of the voice. Historians trace this device to the Spanish Inquisition, from where it spread throughout Europe. Metal versions have been recovered and preserved in museum collections across Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. The question of whether it was always fatal has a disturbing answer: no. Many victims survived the pear but lived with permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, and psychological trauma. That was often the real punishment, not death but ruination, transforming someone into a living warning of what disobedience costs. The victim became a walking reminder that some forms of damage can't be healed, some violations can be undone, and some forms of power can reach inside your body and reshape you against your will. When metal devices seemed too sophisticated or expensive, executioners turned to nature's most abundant torture tool: hunger. Rat torture exemplifies how simple biology can be weaponized into nightmare fuel. You're bound to a wooden table, naked from the waist up. A metal bucket is placed on your stomach, and inside that bucket is a live rat. Then fire is lit on top of the bucket. As the metal heats up, the rat inside panics from the rising temperature. It searches frantically for escape, and there's only one direction available: down, through your flesh. The rat begins digging with claws and teeth, burrowing into your abdomen to escape the heat above. This method wasn't mythology or propaganda. It was documented and used across Europe, South America, and ancient China. The Spanish Inquisition employed it. Dutch colonizers used it in South America. The most infamous documented use occurred under Diederik Sonoy, a Dutch rebel leader in the 1500s who used rat torture against Catholic prisoners and political enemies. The timeline of suffering was precise and predictable. Depending on how hot the bucket became and how quickly the rat could burrow, the process lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. Guards often gagged victims because the screaming was so intense it disturbed even hardened executioners. The rat, driven entirely by survival instinct with no malice or understanding, would literally eat its way through skin, muscle, and sometimes into the abdominal cavity before either dying inside the victim or escaping through the other side. In some prison systems, rats weren't used for acute torture, but for prolonged suffering. Prisoners were kept in rat-infested cells where the rodents would bite and gnaw constantly. Sometimes rats were sewn into clothing or bedding so they would burrow into the body slowly over days. In 20th century Chile, under Pinochet's dictatorship, rats were used in sexual torture against female detainees, continuing this ancient practice into modern times. What makes rat torture particularly effective from a torturer's perspective is its simplicity. No expensive equipment, no special training, no maintenance. Just time, hunger, and the complete absence of humanity. The method also creates profound psychological trauma. Victims who survived often developed severe phobias, not just of rats, but of enclosed spaces, heat, and even metal objects. The torture didn't end when the rat stopped moving. It continued in the victim's mind for the rest of their life. History's methods grew stranger as authorities searched for new ways to inspire dread, and the cradle of Judas represents torture's bizarre intersection with furniture. At first glance, it resembled a simple wooden frame with a swing mechanism, but mounted at the center was a sharp metal pyramid, and the pyramid's tip was aimed upward. Prisoners were stripped naked, bound with ropes under their arms and around their legs, and slowly lowered onto the pyramid's point, which was positioned to penetrate the anus or vagina. They weren't dropped suddenly. The lowering was gradual, controlled, allowing the tip to pierce skin slowly, while gravity did the real work. Then the actual torture began. Guards would rock the victim's body back and forth, up and down, using momentum and weight to force the pyramid progressively deeper into the body. There was no blood at first, just unbearable pressure. But within minutes, muscles tore, nerves ruptured, and internal organs shifted from their natural positions. Victims typically passed out from pain shock within the first hour, only to be revived with cold water or smelling salts so the torture could continue. This device was used extensively during the Spanish Inquisition, particularly for crimes of heresy, homosexuality, and adultery. It was framed as spiritual purification through physical suffering. And this wasn't a single-session punishment. Some victims were brought to the cradle multiple days in a row, their wounds reopening each morning before healing could begin. The pyramid was rarely cleaned between uses, meaning infections were virtually guaranteed. Most victims who didn't bleed to death within the first session died days later from sepsis. Historical medical records indicate that survival rates after multiple sessions were below 15%. One Inquisition document describes a woman forced onto the cradle 12 times over 1 week. Her intestines ruptured on the 5th day, yet the torture continued for 7 more sessions. The cradle represents a particular cruelty, using the victim's own body weight as the primary torture mechanism. It's passive violence, requiring minimal effort from executioners while maximizing internal damage. The victim literally destroys themselves through the simple act of existing in space. Where the cradle used gravity, the Brazen Bull used heat, and transformed human screams into public entertainment. From the outside, it looked magnificent. A life-size bronze bull statue, beautifully crafted and artistically impressive. But it was hollow, and that hollow space was designed to hold a human being. Prisoners were shoved inside through a door in the bull's side, which was then locked and sealed. A fire was lit underneath, turning the bronze statue into a giant oven. The metal heated from the bottom up, slowly roasting whoever was trapped inside. Within minutes, the victim's skin began to blister and crack. But death didn't come quickly because bronze conducts heat gradually, creating a prolonged cooking process. Here's where the device's design becomes truly diabolical. The bull's head contained specially crafted pipes running through the nostrils and mouth. When the victim screamed from being burned alive, those screams traveled through the pipes and emerged, sounding like the bull was roaring. The designers literally turned human agony into sound effects for the entertainment of watching crowds. The Brazen Bull was invented by Paralas of Athens, who built it for Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas in Sicily around 560 BCE. But in one of history's great ironies, Paralas became the first victim of his own creation. Legend says Phalaris wanted to test the device's acoustic properties, so he threw the inventor inside and listened to how his screams sounded. The body inside would cook for hours, fat rendered and melted. Muscles contracted and shrank, bones cracked from heat expansion. When executioners finally opened the door, all that remained was roasted flesh, which was often fed to dogs or dumped in fields outside the city. This device wasn't used once and forgotten. Roman emperors, including Nero and Caligula, reportedly reused it for criminals, traitors, and Christians. In 287 CE, Saint Eustace and his entire family were roasted alive inside a bronze bull for refusing to worship Roman gods. The bull became a symbol of ultimate martyrdom in early Christian texts, but it was also a symbol of how far rulers would go to assert dominance. Cooking someone alive inside a statue wasn't just execution, it was theological theater, demonstrating that earthly power could transform humans into meaningless meat. From burning to flaying, the Spanish tickler represented the opposite approach. Instead of cooking flesh, it peeled it off in strips. This wasn't a mechanical device or elaborate construction. It was simply 4 curved iron hooks shaped like claws, attached to a handle, but simplicity made it no less horrific. The Spanish tickler, also called the cat's paw or iron claw, was dragged across bare flesh with enough force to tear skin, muscle, and sometimes fat from the bone in long, bloody ribbons. Used extensively across Europe, especially in Spain, France, and Germany from the 15th to 18th centuries, this torture tool appeared both in private dungeons and public executions. The process was methodical. First, victims were tied to a post and stripped naked. Then the torturer would drag the claw across their chest, back, arms, and legs repeatedly until skin literally hung in sheets. Blood sprayed with each stroke, and crowds gathered to watch every moment. According to court records from 1547 in Barcelona, a woman accused of heresy was clawed continuously for 3 hours. She survived the ordeal but was left blind, deaf, and missing most of her skin. She was then abandoned in a prison cell where she died from infection days later. Sometimes the claws were heated in fire before use, adding burning to the tearing. This double trauma, ripping and searing simultaneously, created pain so intense that victims often bit through their own tongues. The tickler could be used to rip off breasts, genitals, faces, or tear open the stomach cavity. No part of the body was protected or off-limits. The tool's versatility made it popular among executioners because it required no setup, no maintenance, and could be used anywhere. All it needed was human strength and complete lack of mercy. This exploration now shifts from loud, bloody spectacle to something quieter but no less deadly. The garrote represents minimalist execution, a chair, a collar, and slow strangulation combined with spinal crushing. It starts simple enough: a seat and a metal band or rope placed around the neck. Behind the chair is a screw mechanism or lever. When the executioner turns it, the band tightens gradually, pushing either a sharp point or solid rod into the back of the neck or base of the skull. This wasn't about bleeding out. It was about choking, crushing the windpipe, and breaking the spinal cord while the victim remained conscious and aware. Used widely in Spain, Portugal, and their colonies from the 17th century all the way to the 1970s, the garrote was paradoxically promoted as a humane execution method because it left no mess, no blood, no gruesome visual aftermath. But that claim was a calculated lie. Victims struggled for 2 to 4 minutes on average, faces turning purple, eyes bulging, veins popping in their foreheads, before finally collapsing. In Spain, the garrote remained a legal execution method until 1974. The last person executed this way was Salvador Puig Antich, a Catalan anarchist convicted of killing a police officer. His death was so prolonged and obviously painful that even his jailers later admitted the execution went wrong. The screw mechanism jammed partway through, forcing him to suffocate slowly over 6 full minutes instead of the intended quick spinal snap. Earlier versions of the garrote used rope twisted with sticks, where the executioner simply twisted and twisted until the throat collapsed inward. Later designs added a sharp iron spike that penetrated the spinal cord with each crank of the screw, attempting to make death more certain, though rarely quicker. Sometimes families were forced to watch these executions. In colonial Latin America, the garrote was used on enslaved people and rebels in public squares to maintain social control through terror. The garrote embodies a particular philosophy of execution. Death should be certain, relatively contained, and mechanically simple, but suffering remains non-negotiable. Where the garrote crushed quickly, Lingchi took the opposite approach entirely, extending the moment of death across hours through thousands of individual cuts. Known in the West as death by 1,000 cuts, this was an official execution method in Imperial China for over a millennium, used extensively during the Ming and Qing dynasties. It was reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, patricide, killing one's parents, or betraying the emperor. Sometimes it was simply used to send an unmistakable political message. The process was ritualized in public. The victim was tied to a wooden frame in a town square, exposed to crowds who were encouraged to watch. Then an executioner with specialized training began making small, precise cuts, starting with extremities like the arms and legs, progressing to the chest and abdomen, and finally reaching the face. The goal was explicit: keep the person alive and conscious for as long as possible. Records indicate some victims received between 300 and 3,000 cuts before dying. It wasn't just physical destruction, it was psychological annihilation. Crowds gathered, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Family members were often forced to witness, and the first 100 cuts were intentionally non-lethal, removing only skin and superficial tissue. The fatal cut, usually to the heart or major artery in the neck, came last, sometimes hours after the torture began. Photographs from the early 1900s, when Lingchi was still legal, provide haunting documentation. They show men fully skinned in places, eyes still open, clearly still alive in their final moments. One particularly infamous case from 1905, captured by French soldiers in China, shows a man receiving multiple cuts to his chest and legs, while crowds look on with mixed expressions of horror and curiosity. Executioners were rigorously trained to keep victims alive, sometimes using opium or other stimulants to prevent them from passing out and escaping through unconsciousness. This was torture as bureaucratic procedure, as public demonstration of state power, as slow erasure of individual identity and dignity. The condemned didn't just die, they were methodically unmade. From cutting flesh to crushing bone, thumbscrews represent torture's most portable form, small enough to fit in a torturer's pocket, yet capable of inflicting pain that made grown men faint. The device was elegantly simple: 2 flat metal bars with holes for fingers or thumbs, connected by a screw that, when tightened, brought the bars together with increasing pressure. First it crushed skin, then it broke nails. Finally, the bones inside fingers cracked one by one with audible pops. Victims didn't bleed much, but they passed out frequently from pure pain, and most begged for death before the second hand even went into the device. Thumbscrews appeared everywhere. In Scotland, they were called penny-winks and used extensively on religious dissenters. In the Salem witch trials of 1692, accused witches were threatened with thumbscrews to force confessions. Reports describe victims fainting within 5 minutes of application. In some variations, hot coals were placed beneath the metal bars to heat the screws, while crushing, cooking skin and breaking bones simultaneously. Other versions featured internal spikes, so the device didn't just crush but also punctured and shredded nerves. The long-term impact was devastating. Most victims who survived, and survival was common because the torture was usually stopped before death, had permanently mangled fingers. They couldn't write, couldn't hold utensils, couldn't perform fine motor tasks ever again. Total helplessness became a permanent condition. The thumbscrew's genius, from a torturer's perspective, was its precision and control. Unlike beating or burning, where damage could be excessive and uncontrolled, the thumbscrew allowed exact calibration of pain. 1/4 turn more, 1/4 turn back. The torturer had complete power over the intensity and duration of suffering. Not all torture focused on crushing or cutting. The heretic's fork took a different approach, forced wakefulness until the mind completely shattered. This device was small, deceptively simple, just 2 metal prongs attached to a leather strap. One prong pointed upward, the other downward. The strap went around the victim's neck, positioning one prong just under the chin and the other against the sternum or throat. If the victim tried to lower their head to sleep, the prongs stabbed deeper into flesh. If they screamed or cried, same result. The only way to avoid stabbing was to hold the head perfectly still for hours, eventually days. Used primarily by the Spanish Inquisition during the 15th and 16th centuries against those accused of blasphemy, witchcraft, or heresy, the heretic's fork caused minimal blood loss but maximum psychological devastation. Prisoners often began hallucinating after 24 hours of forced wakefulness. By 48 hours, they were begging incoherently for death, twitching, drooling, completely dissociated from reality. In one recorded case in Toledo, Spain, a prisoner wore the fork for 72 consecutive hours. He died standing up, frozen in position, eyes still open. The fork didn't draw much blood, which made it perfect for the Inquisition's purposes. Victims could be tortured for extended periods and still appear presentable for trial or public execution later. The goal was breaking the mind before breaking the body, destroying will and identity before ever inflicting lethal damage. Sleep deprivation combined with constant pain created a unique form of torture that left few visible marks but caused complete mental collapse. From psychological torture to joint destruction, the knee splitter represents engineering dedicated entirely to permanent crippling. 2 heavy iron bars studded with inward-facing spikes were placed around a victim's knee. As torturers cranked a handle, the bars closed tighter. Spikes pierced skin first, puncturing from both sides simultaneously. But with each turn of the mechanism, ligaments tore, cartilage popped, bones cracked and finally collapsed entirely. Victims didn't just lose the ability to walk, they lost the entire structural integrity of their legs. Popular during the Spanish Inquisition and in parts of Germany and Italy, this device was used on accused witches, rebels, and anyone requiring coercion without immediate execution. Some designs featured up to 20 spikes per bar, all concentrated on destroying one joint as efficiently as possible. Some versions were heated in fires before application, adding burning to the crushing. According to records from Venice in 1582, a man accused of plotting against the Doge had both knees crushed in under 4 minutes. He never spoke again, shock and pain rendering him mute. In cases where victims were scheduled for public execution afterward, torturers would deliberately crush only one leg, leaving the other intact. The resulting limp became a public signature, a visible mark of survival and shame that followed the person through whatever remained of their life. The breaking wheel escalated from single joint destruction to total skeletal dismemberment. This wasn't hidden torture. It was performed on raised platforms in town squares specifically so crowds could watch from every angle. The breaking wheel was a large wooden cartwheel with spokes. The victim was stripped naked and tied across it, arms and legs stretched between gaps in the spokes. Then an executioner approached with a large iron bar or hammer and began systematically smashing. The goal wasn't quick killing. It was breaking every single limb, arms, legs, even ribs without touching vital organs. Strikes were carefully placed between joints, targeting bones and muscle to cause maximum pain while maintaining life. In 18th century Germany, a man named Peter Nyers, convicted of murder and cannibalism, was broken over the wheel and received 42 separate bone fractures before dying. Some victims survived for days, left on display, bleeding, paralyzed, their shattered limbs twisted through the wheel's spokes like rope. In France, executioners sometimes braided the broken limbs through the wheel structure, then hoisted it upright like a grotesque flag, letting birds and dogs eat the still living victim. Bodies were left as warnings for weeks. According to 18th century court records, the wheel remained in official use in parts of Europe until the 1830s. Crowds gathered, children pointed, priests prayed, and bones kept snapping in sickening rhythm. Everything we've discussed so far involved tools, weapons, or mechanical devices. But Scaphism, used by ancient Persians, weaponized nature itself. The victim was stripped naked and placed between 2 boats or hollowed logs sandwiched together with only head, arms, and legs exposed. Then force feeding began. Torturers poured milk and honey down the victim's throat until violent diarrhea started. Then they smeared more honey over exposed skin, particularly eyes, mouth, genitals, and any open wounds. Then they left the victim floating in a stagnant swamp or tied near a forest. Flies arrived first, then beetles, ants, and other insects. First came bites. Then eggs were laid in wounds and natural openings. Within hours, the victim's lower body became a living nest, crawling with insects that burrowed, bit, and ate continuously. According to the ancient Greek historian Plutarch, one soldier named Mithridates lasted 17 days before finally dying. His body was found, unrecognizable, skin shredded, internal organs rotting, eyes gone. He had been executed for killing King Artaxerxes II's brother. The victim couldn't move, couldn't clean themselves, couldn't fight back. They died in their own waste, eaten alive by thousands of tiny mouths while remaining conscious for days. Many torture methods targeted both men and women, but some were designed specifically for women, with pain aimed not just at the body, but at identity and femininity. The breast ripper was explicitly gendered torture. Shaped like a claw with 4 sharp curved hooks like bird talons, it was designed to tear rather than grip. Victims were usually women accused of adultery, abortion, heresy, or simply disobedience. Sometimes they were guilty of nothing except refusing to marry the right man. Once condemned, they were tied upright in town squares or courtyards and stripped naked from the waist up. The claw was heated in fire until it glowed red. Then it was clamped around each breast and ripped away from the chest wall in one brutal pulling motion. Wounds were massive. Muscle, skin, and sometimes rib fragments came off with the tissue. In France, Germany, and Italy between the 13th and 17th centuries, breast mutilation was standard punishment for women accused of dishonoring men or violating sexual norms. In one recorded execution from 1559 in Bavaria, the woman's breasts were torn off and her remains were left on public display for 3 days. If the victim survived the first tearing, a second followed. If she still lived after that, she was usually burned at the stake or left to die from infection in a cell. This wasn't just torture, it was targeted punishment, removing body parts specifically associated with femininity, sexuality, and motherhood, destroying not just the person but what she represented. Impalement represents perhaps the most iconic torture in historical memory, though the reality was far worse than popular imagination suggests. The Judas Cradle. Variant used a tall, narrow pyramid of metal mounted on a wooden frame. Victims were stripped naked, bound by waist, arms, and legs, then slowly lowered onto the sharpened point positioned beneath the anus or vagina. The victim's own body weight drove the pyramid deeper over time. There was no sudden stab, just slow stretching that transformed into tearing. Executioners would raise and lower the ropes for hours, lifting the victim slightly, then letting them drop again, each time driving the point deeper. Muscles tore, skin split, nerves screamed. But the point wasn't sharp enough to kill quickly. It was designed to cause maximum internal damage over time, used widely during the Spanish Inquisition, and also in Italy, France, and Germany during the 15th through 17th centuries. Victims could survive 2 to 3 days, usually dying from infection, shock, or internal bleeding. One Inquisition record from Sicily in 1631 describes a woman tortured for refusing to confess heresy. She was placed on the cradle twice daily for 4 days, eventually dying with ruptured intestines and internal organs spilling into the frame. The pyramid was rarely cleaned between sessions, making death from sepsis virtually guaranteed. Moving from impalement to disembowelment, belly hooking represents torture at its most visceral. Victims were chained up with arms stretched overhead and stomach fully exposed. An executioner approached carrying a large iron hook. The hook penetrated below the ribs deep into the gut, then pulled slowly, hard enough to tear through layers of flesh and muscle, until intestines emerged like rope being unspooled. This method was performed publicly in markets, castle courtyards, and city streets to send unmistakable messages. Used in medieval England, France, and the Ottoman Empire, especially against traitors and rebels, the goal was creating spectacle, not efficiency. In some cases, intestines were nailed to posts, and victims were forced to walk, literally unspooling their own guts as they moved forward. One documented case from Hungary in 1523 involved a nobleman being disemboweled while still conscious and talking. His intestines were pulled out 12 feet before he finally passed out. Some hooks were barbed, tearing more tissue on removal than on entry. Executioners sometimes twisted the hook inside the body, deliberately shredding liver, stomach, or kidneys before the final pull. This was message torture, embodying the belief that betrayal comes from the gut, and extracting the gut proved the point. Finally, we reach what many historians consider the absolute worst: flaying, being skinned alive as both execution and political propaganda. This method was saved for traitors, rebels, and enemies of the state across Assyria, Persia, China, and medieval Europe. The process started with careful incisions at wrists or ankles, then peeling one layer at a time from head to toe. Executioners used small, extremely sharp knives that could separate skin from muscle without immediately killing. They started at extremities, moved to the torso, and finished with the face. Victims stayed conscious for up to 2 hours, screaming, shaking, eyes wide with terror as their own skin was peeled like wet fabric. The ancient Assyrians actually nailed victims' skins to city walls. A real Assyrian tablet from 700 BCE describes the king's enemies being flayed and their hides stretched across gates as warnings. In medieval France, a man named Pierre Basile was skinned alive in 1199 for killing King Richard the Lionheart. His body was flayed in front of assembled soldiers, then burned. Sometimes the removed skin was stuffed with straw and hung like scarecrows at city gates. The pain was unimaginable because nerves directly under skin are extremely sensitive. Every breeze, every insect, every particle of dust felt like fire on raw flesh. This final method wasn't just about torture, it was about erasing identity, turning a human into a message, transforming person into policy. Now you've seen all 20 methods, each designed to stretch the body, break the mind, and silence people forever. History tried to hide these horrors, bury them in footnotes and academic obscurity. But now you know the truth about what humans are capable of when cruelty becomes law and suffering becomes spectacle.